Hello and welcome again to one of our TLC podcasts. Today I'm fortunate enough to have Dr. Abigail Wright, who's an educational psychologist, joining us. Hi Abby and welcome.
Hello, thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Lovely. Now Abby, you've just taken part in writing a chapter in this book, Children in Lockdown and Learning the Lessons of Pandemic Times. Obviously a very topical subject to be talking about, having just gone through a pandemic.
Yeah.
So I was just wondering if you could tell us a little bit about yourself and your family and your inspiration for this. I know in terms of the book itself, there are many other people who've contributed to this, in lines of social work, education, teachers, and people from different backgrounds.
Yeah.
So from your perspective, though, in the chapter that you've written, what is the title of your chapter? Can you give us a little... caregiving for children and young during the pandemic.
Yeah.
So what was your inspiration? And tell us a little bit about your background.
Yeah. So hello everyone. As I was wonderfully introduced, I'm Abigail.
Overly introduced, maybe.
And I'm an educational psychologist with a very special interest with the early years. So I currently work full time for a local authority in South Wales. And within that role, I have a specialism within the early years. So obviously there was a desire from the beginning, particularly to focus within the early years, and often as well, I think it's really highlighted through particular groups such as the Parent Infant Foundation, etc., that a lot of the time during the pandemic, lots of children and young people, rightly so, were heavily focused on in terms of thinking how that might impact their well-being and development. But there were calls from certain charities and groups to focus more heavily on babies and young children. Yeah. It was felt that these were often forgotten from policy, almost completely not mentioned at times. And being obviously an educational psychologist myself, working with this particular age range and having two very young children as well. So I've got a now 2-year-old and a 5-year-old. And at the time... my little girl, when we went into the pandemic, was about 12 weeks as well. So my own sort of pandemic baby, as they said. And what I was hearing from the media at this time was some huge concerns, again, mostly later on in development, about what children were missing out on. That's what it was kind of aimed at. So there
focused very much on the negative, didn't it?
Yes, so very much focused on concerns, very much focused on what not going and having different experiences might have, and also quite a lot of doom and gloom. And I think in the book launch, a few of colleagues rightly sort of alluded to it as this awfulization in the media. And yes, we cannot deny that there has been huge consequences and impacts for certain children during lockdown. And it's very important that we take that into account as well going forward. But as we know from research, for example, from the Children's Commissioner in Wales, who did a fantastic job in leading and gathering the views of children and young people across Wales, we know that there was a huge variety of different effects. So yes, some with huge consequences and more in what we might call the more challenging situations. But also there were opportunities of for positive, interactions with families at home, and sometimes these increased, and obviously you can imagine how that might affect family well-being and development. New experiences, new hobbies, this element of kind of trying to think about the best in a difficult situation. So even those for then experiencing more challenging situations, there were lots of stories of hope and how the community came together to support things going forward as well, I think. So I say that, but at the same time, something that I'm really concerned about, but also want to view in a hopeful light about what we can do, is really what the pandemic for me did is highlight the growing inequalities that were already there in sort of society as well. So lots of people talk about the pandemic as if it's this singular thing. The pandemic has happened, and these cohort of children, as the terms are usually described, are now going to be these sort of like pandemic children, and they'll all be sort of demonstrating certain characteristics or experiences, and it's very generalised as if the pandemic's going to have this kind of negative impact. But I think what I feel really strongly about is what the pandemic has done has provided circumstances for some children where there were already significant challenges or even slight challenges, and that has exacerbated that. So it's not necessarily that the pandemic will lead to these inevitable negative outcomes, but it is a case of it can add a layer of challenges, for example, lack of support, what I've termed the kind of psychological and physical space would being reduced as well. So obviously as a new parent, for example, I wasn't a new parent as such, but I had a new baby at the time, can totally relate to experiences of how important that support network was, and then inevitably in many circumstances that was completely changed,
taken away.
So that could impact, not necessarily did. It could be that for whatever reason at home you had a really positive network within the home environment, or it could be that it also reduced some of those demands that do come with a new arrival sometimes as well. So I think going forward, what I really want to kind of learn from learning lessons from the pandemic is around how we need to look at what is already happening in our communities and our society and learn from that in terms of kind of moving things forward. So at the moment, there's a lot of talk around speech around recovery and helping children catch up. Lost learning, lost opportunities.
Very much again focusing on that negative and
exactly that. And I think what we would as many psychologists and colleagues that I have in mind, we were really arguing against that catch-up narrative. So that what are we actually trying to catch up from? This is a pandemic that's been experienced by all. And should we not just be looking at individuals with unique strengths, interests, unique experiences, whatever happens, and then meeting people where they're at and moving on towards that as well? Because like I said, it could have been positive, it could have been negative. Schooling is a very much a hot topic, especially for us as educational psychologists. And I suppose, yes, there could be challenges. And I think it's very important that children have access to community support and education regardless. But there has been some ways that some children have benefited from a more flexible style or a more personalised learning. And what's really positive for us in Wales is I think some of the philosophy behind that is very much embedded into the new curriculum in that's going to be launching in September, around that recognition that every child is a unique child and that they require a personalised learning experience. So I do hope that's something that we can learn from the pandemic, is kind of, again, looking at the child as a unique child and not trying to make something fit the child, but how can we fit around the child and support. So moving back onto kind of the chapter and the contribution I sort of related to the early years and caregiving, I wanted to try, and I guess the key inspiration was to try and provide some hope.
Right,
so
yes.
I had lots of my own friends, colleagues, huge discussions around, I think for the early years, one thing that was particularly highlighted was kind of the, I'll say in quotes for people who can't see or see, but around this kind of lack of social opportunities or no social opportunities at all. This was a huge example that I was hearing in the media and from others around. One thing that has reduced, I think we can hands down say that the pandemic did for all of us, was kind of change our social opportunities or a social network, isn't it, in that sense? So I think people attributed that to no social skills. So people were saying, well, if we haven't got these social opportunities,
you're hearing that a lot.
I'm really concerned about how my young child is going to develop social skills. So one key message which I kind of tried to promote during that time was, and debunk the myth around that, was that you don't necessarily, as a baby or a young child, obviously it provides a different opportunity through different people and different experiences, but the best kind of support actually in those early stages is given with their primary caregivers.
Right, yeah.
And one thing that will be a huge support and a buffer for any challenges, be it a pandemic or crisis or anything, is that relationship between a caregiver and their child and building that positive, strong attachment. So that was one example of the myth, was that you don't necessarily, and I think it's a very easy assumption, very logical assumption to make, is that we often talk about children go into playgroups or go into social events so that they can develop these social skills. But it's, again, to empower parents to remember that they actually have the tools that they need to do a lot of support in their child's development.
The important thing is that child getting the stimulation and the right stimulation, isn't it? So it doesn't have to come from outside of the home, like you're saying, you know, spending time with your baby at home and building that bond.
Absolutely, yes, absolutely. And so it was these kind of messages that I felt really strongly that I didn't want to produce huge amounts of unnecessary anxiety for parents. And then the other thing I thought of, Kate, I'm not saying that doesn't come without challenges in all sorts, and those challenges as well, they still exist, be it a pandemic or not. And I think we have to start getting serious about recognising that for some people, these kind of challenges are there, these isolation, the lack of support network, etc. And we need to look beyond the pandemic in order to support that. And what we really need to do as well is not sort of focus within the individual all the time about the individual might have a lack of social skills now, or that the parent had that huge role. Obviously a parent does have a huge role, I didn't mean it to say like that, but what we're trying to pinpoint it on the individuals all the time, where society and communities have an absolutely huge part to play in this. So again, that example of a myth or a message that's communicated in the media, or for whatever means, policy, general advice that we're giving to parents, that could have a huge impact on their child's development and kind of impact on how we interact day to day. For example, parents who might have felt that this pandemic, whatever I do, means that my child's going to be developing in a different way, or perhaps with a negative impact, and that might have started interacting with their children very differently, or could have taken quite a hit in terms of their own well-being as well. But if we flip that on the head and say, actually, you have lots of tools within you. I'm not denying the huge challenges that are going on in the world, for instance, that you can't control, but there are things that you can. And there's lots and lots of important things that you have a role in doing that will massively impact on your child's development. That could have a whole different journey for the family and the child as well. So I think the focus of the chapter was very much around, obviously, a little bit of experience around kind of the messages that I said around the media, etc., and how the society and community have a role in that, to not kind of place it all on the parents, caregivers, but also some really sort of practical hints and tips around what we can do in those times. So things based on attachment, things based on emotion coaching, even, you know, how maybe we could talk to our children around the pandemic or emotions or worries. So it's really got that kind of what we can do and hopeful edge on things going forward.
That's quite a key point you're saying there about talking to children, because of course they do get to hear a lot, don't they?
Yeah.
They get to hear from parents. They pick up on the worries and the concerns. So I think that open dialogue as well is really important, isn't it, in helping children to understand as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, something that is key for children is, I think, you know, if we don't kind of give them factual, honest, appropriate information that they are able to kind of make sense of in their own ways, with whatever differences or needs they have, they might be left to kind of make sense and interpret that on their own, and that could be a really confusing, overwhelming place to be, or it might not, but we're at risk in that, aren't we?
Yes,
so
exactly,
it's very important to, as a role, to keep talking in that factual, open and honest way, obviously appropriate to the understanding and communication preferences of a child as well. Yeah.
Okay. Well, Abby, that's amazing. You've given us a lot of insight into that chapter and giving us a lot of useful information. What I was particularly interested in, you know, is that a kind of more of a positive look on things as well, you know, and flipping things, like you say, you know, and thinking about actually, because for some of our foster carers as well. You know, I've heard some quite positive stories about how children have actually coped better for some children during that lockdown period, where they're able to be at home in that same environment, and that consistency that it's given them, instead of, you know, continual change and transitions from school to taxis to home to, you know. So some children, it's been a real positive impact on their behavior and less anxiety. You know, so it's very good to hear you saying these things as well. And along those lines that we were just talking about, I know you've also recently just written a blog.
Yeah.
Could you tell us a little bit about that? And
yeah, of course. So, kind of related to some of the stuff that I was just talking to you about, I think about a fortnight ago, Ofsted put out a big kind of report around, again, lessons learned through pandemic times, with all the view, very much a policy at the moment is focused within education around, obviously I know we're Wales, but it's still very relevant, is around recovery, and like I said, some of the narratives around that catch-up learning and what that might look like going forward. Now, I was really, really pleased to see that in this Ofsted report that they had highlighted specifically a focus around the early years, which is often, like I said, sometimes missed. So really encouraged to see that has got a kind of a big push behind it. However, at the same time, again, personal concerns, it's almost like hashtag views of my own at this point. Personal concerns were very much around, again, highlighting children's, as they term it, delays across all areas because of the pandemic. I think what comes out in most reports and particularly in the media snippets that you get is that the pandemic has led to delays across particularly speech, language and communication, but across the board for children. And this was something that was coming out of that Ofsted report. And again, so like I said, I've got real concerns with that being attributed purely to the pandemic. And something that I really wanted to focus on is what can we do going forward? Obviously, there's lots of different challenges with collecting data, generally, around lots of individual children. There's huge variables associated with that. And I think that these delays that they were referring through, they were all attributed, again, like I said, to the pandemic. So there were things like these children haven't been in playgroups, that they're going to have difficulties talking or participating in group work. Another thing, sometimes, you know, quite formalised language for 2 or 3 year olds doing group activities, presentations. No, I'm joking. But sort of my concern was around, well, it's not necessarily the pandemic as such. Again, growing inequalities, difficult, challenging circumstances. And what I would really like to see is not that focus on recovery, but what I've written in the blog about is a focus on discovery. So reframing and turning that narrative on, well, these children aren't or individuals aren't people to be fixed or recover from something. Like, this isn't a medical condition. And I really, what that does is place that there is something potentially wrong with someone or the child. So again, and if we do that, we are looking towards the individual and responding to the individual in a completely different way. Whereas what we should be doing is looking at what support do we give children, young people, families, communities to help us develop as a society. What do we do? What does a child need, and what support can we give? Because the other way of looking at it is that this child has this maybe a score that it can't potentially be translated into anything, but there's lots of standardized scores that are used for children. When we're looking at development, which again I could go into some challenges with that, but it places the focus then on, like I said, that individual and needing something particular. But what we really need to do is look at what a child's strengths, interests are, take that person-centred approach and put specific tailored strategies and support to move and to help with development going forward. So I wrote this little blog about that, just a few 500 words or something, but really calling for people to kind of give a little bit of hope to the future, but also to try and change this language loose that in itself can be disadvantageous
Well, that's
for
it, because
everyone
language
as
is
well.
so powerful, isn't
hugely
it?
powerful.
Yeah.
And sometimes not even our society, etc., but it's the languages and the messages, etc., that even in our subconscious make a difference to what we do. And I think, you know, there is so much pressure on caregivers, so families, parents, carers, people, supporters of the early years as it is. You know, the early years settings themselves have huge challenges in terms of the pressures that they've faced from that more practical standpoint, and running sort of their businesses, etc., as well during the pandemic. And so if we keep kind of focusing on the individual children, the worry is as well that we are not going to change what is really needed to be changed
at a wider level.
At a wider level, yeah. So for childcare settings, a huge issue has been staffing and sustainability. So if we again are thinking, oh, something's going on or particularly wrong with these children, but then are not addressing that maybe actually there's huge, you know, problems with ratios and staffing. I know this is something again that has been in the media this week around saving money in childcare, and a suggestion has been to cut the staffing ratios, which I would argue we're completely against. If we want to save money if within the early years, one way to do that is definitely not to pull the support and resources from the early years. And something, you know, I'm so passionate about the early years is because really it's our hope for the future. It's a hope for what we want to become, isn't it? And I'm always really encouraged, for example, like the work by the Duchess at the moment, and everything that she's doing around the early years, recognising that, you know, that is what we want for society in the future as well. And she's doing some fantastic work within the early years too. So yeah, so as an aside then as well, so that was one particular blog, and I feel quite passionately about when these topics come up in the media, I try and blog about them when I can, in my very little spare time between being a mum and working and the juggle struggle that's real in between. So I've also got a little page on Instagram and Facebook, which is called Psyched Mum, like Psych Ed Mum. It's still quite in its infancy because they do take quite a lot of time to
that's kind of it. There's a lot of time and effort to put into it.
But I recognise, you know, that as well. I'm really interested in about how we communicate messages as well. And I recognise, you know, lengthy blogs, some of the things that we might normally do. A psychologist, reports, research, articles, you know, even for when I was doing my thesis, they can be, you know, difficult to kind of take in. And I think something that we really need to look at is how we make things generally accessible. That's why I went into this role, was for inclusion, to support inclusion of all. So within my Instagram and my Facebook pages, then I've got a little it's like an infographic blog, really. So I posted different infographics on these topics and themes. So I talked about, for example, and they're also available in the chapter, some of them a selection. So I talked about how, you know, the socialization aspect we talked about earlier. One of the messages that I put out for that was around, you know, socialization doesn't mean social with, you know, other people outside of the home. You can still do that within the home. This was, you know, during the pandemic time. There's another one around you have the tools and, you know, various little infographic bits about all the things that you can do to support early child development. And within that, the things that are most important. So play, connection, having fun, well-being, and that's something that I really feel passionate about as well, particularly within the early years, because we're so at an early stage of our development. But we need all these things in place before as precursors to other aspects of development. So another one of my infographics, I sort of described what I've called like the foundations to learning. So I've drawn out a little house, and at the bottom I've got all the bricks, the things that you need at the bottom to build the foundations for learning. So safety, you know, love, enjoyment, play, positive well-being, to try and illustrate some of these more difficult or complex psychological concepts. A real value of mine is trying to make psychology fun and make sense and make it accessible for families, because with kind of these roles sometimes, hopefully not less, but there can be jargon or difficult.
Well, that's it. And I think it can be
things.
quite a scary thing for people as well to hear the psychologist is coming, isn't it? Because people have this conception of a psychologist being somebody out there that you can't actually reach as well. So being more accessible and being there is definitely something.
Yeah. So if we're not accessible in the first place, how on earth can we have, support those positive outcomes, isn't it? And that's another thing that I'm really passionate about.
Sounds like you've got loads of things going on, Abby. I really hope that you'll be able to achieve these things, because it's amazing the things that you're talking about.
Oh, well, I certainly feel really passionately about it, and just that concept even of people not, feeling alone with things, that community psychology and everyday magic that I know that the NEST framework in Wales talks about, and how important that is for well-being. And I think, psychology, our role can sound quite complex.
Yes.
The other thing that we need to remember is that, like I said, the value in everyday experiences and magic, and how everyone has a really important role to play in supporting children's development as well.
Oh, Abby, thank you so much. It's been so interesting talking. I'm sure we could actually carry on for a lot longer, but perhaps we'll have you back for another blog sometime. Okay. Thank you.
Oh, thank you ever so much.
Okay.